So, back to CrimeWar podcast. For those who don't know me, my name is Ioan Grillo. I'm a journalist and writer originally from the UK. I've been here in Mexico City for 19 years now. Spent a lot of that time reporting on crime, war, the mixture between the two, and all of these internet-related issues, the drug war, all of these things that are so important, but we really only skim the surface of it in the mainstream media. So in this podcast series, I'm really looking to taking a deeper dive, and great today to talk to David Farber. Is that correct pronunciation? David Farber, a distinguished historian, a very well-recognized historian who's been looking at modern American history, and the latest book is on the crack era. This is fascinating to me. You've done a lot of books on the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, I think some of the stuff, Pearl Harbor and stuff, the 70s, and now getting to the 80s. It's the first time I've seen the crack era really treated as a historical issue. You know, it's often an issue we kind of think of in pop culture, in hip hop culture, which you cite extensively. But it's great to see a distinguished historian really get into the issue of the crack era. The book is called Crack, Rock Cocaine, Street Capitalism, and the Decade of Greed. Great title. I was just contacted about this book only 2 days ago. You know, right away I was interested. I got sent the PDF and I've been reading that with fascination. You know, one of the things, great to see a playlist with the book going, to Eric Clapton, Cocaine 77, through a lot of classics, NWA, Dope Man, Public Enemy, Night of the Living Bassheads, Notorious B.I.G., the 10 Crack Commandments. You know, great to see these things in a history book. Killer Mike, Reagan, Pusha T, Nostalgia. I mean, Jay-Z, Rap Game, Crack Game. I mean, the list goes on. So great to see in a mainstream history book, and just a bit more background, about David Farber at the University of Kansas. An amazing bibliography, books going back to the conservative 60s, America in the 70s, beyond Pearl Harbor, the rise and fall of modern American conservatism, the Columbia Guide to America in the 60s, the age of great dreams, America in the 60s. So loads of fantastic titles there. So, David, how did you go into this issue of the crack era from the other topics? How do you see this fitting into modern American history?
Yeah, so in some ways, I'm a historian of capitalism. And I've written a lot of books about capitalism from the top down. And I was always fascinated. So what's capitalism look like from the bottom up? And these crack dealers, they're hustlers, they're entrepreneurs, they're risk takers. They're the things that celebrated in Reagan's America. Yeah. These guys ended up incarcerated for 25 years. So, it's a history of capitalism banging into questions like racial justice and the nature of American society and the politics that we live with. And to me, these are the main themes of American history.
Now, like things like the 60s you've written about, and then everyone, can think about the 60s as a great time of American history, a great subject to study. I did some American studies courses when I was at university, and there was one on the 60s then. This going back to the 90s. There was stuff on the 60s then. I haven't seen the crack era in this one. I've seen now more like academics looking at histories of the war on drugs and this kind of thing. But a history of crack. I mean, how do you feel that that fits in? Why do you think that historians haven't yet really identified this as a subject to study in the same way they have the political protests in the 60s or other things?
Yeah, I think this is better than me in some ways. Part of it is it's hard to tell this story. How do you do this story? You can't go to a nice little library or a pleasant little archive and put your fingers through the papers and suddenly you have the whole tale. It's easy to tell a story about presidents or senators or big businessmen. Crack dealers, they don't always want to tell you what's going on. I had a really funny instance where I had like this awesome source. Guy was way up there in crack distribution in a city I will not name. And I was so proud of myself. Man, I nailed this interview. And the minute the guy sees me, he's like, I'd be glad to talk to you, but, you know, I can't tell you about anything that's illegal. That's the point, man. It's pretty funny. So, you know, it's a dangerous world, and it's sometimes hard to crack into that dangerous world. So I did my best, and I think I got a good story to tell.
Right. So your sources, I mean, you did like, there's sometimes that fine line between history and journalism.
Yeah.
There's that cliche almost that, you know, journalists, we write the first draft of history. Yeah. You know, when you have a modern thing, but then how you deal with the things that you're actually doing primary reporting, that almost like goes beyond history to a work of journalism, or is that common among historians to do that same kind of primary reporting? And how do you see that, you know, actually going to interview crack dealers as opposed to just like taking the historical archives and kind of make analysis of this stuff?
You know, I think the trick is that differentiates what a scholar like me tries to do and what a frontline journalist can do is we kind of just have a different angle of entry. So for me, I want to tell the good stories. I'm a storyteller, but it's important for me to put it into a big historical context. So, you know, the last part of my title is The Decade of Greed. So I was really interested in to what extent these drug distributors, how much are they similar to the big finance guys in the 1980s and 90s? What's their mentality? What kind of political regime do they work within? And so I'm constantly thinking about big contexts, not just the foregrounded story. And maybe that's some of the difference between a journalist and a historian. You know, I think journalists sometimes can tell the better story. Historians can sometimes tell the bigger so what. At least I would make that claim.
Yeah, part of that, because we have to keep telling stories to keep making money and keep food on the table. Whereas, you know, a lot of historians, you have at least a university, you know, like supporting the investigations and people going to learn the teaching of historians. I mean, I love history. I studied history. I'm a big fan of the methods of history, and so I love to bring history into journalism. And part of what I want to do with this series is talk more to academics and share this thinking. Now, for people who don't know or how your research showed it, what is crack and how did it come to America?
Yeah, the funny thing is crack is like a low-tech invention. You know, it's like a value-added drug. So crack cocaine and powder cocaine, they're the same thing. They're the same alkaloid. It's just a different method of delivery. And crack is just cocaine mixed with some baking powder, add some water, boil it down, and you create a nice little rock. And that rock can be smoked. And as the drug aficionados out there might know, when you smoke a drug, it gets to your brain a lot quicker than when you snort a drug. It's just, that's the physiological aspect of it. So crack cocaine was a really powerful instant high that some people really liked. It just was a big blast, and it's different than a powder coke high.
So it's actually I didn't quite. I mean, even I've been reporting on drugs for years, and I've been around drugs, or you know, for a lot more years. But I didn't quite know this fact. When you smoke it, it hits you faster than if you snort it. So when people snort a line of cocaine, there's some delayed time before that high kicks in, or do some people feel they're kind of high right away?
You get the high. Don't get me wrong. But physiologically, you know, nasal membranes just don't transmit a drug as effectively as your lungs do. The lungs take it right in the bloodstream, bam, it goes up to your brain, and it hits really hard, and it hits really concentrated. So a crack high is more intense, but of shorter duration than a snorted powder cocaine. If you intravenously use cocaine, that's a different high as well. Same drug, same basic effects, same dopamine, serotonin effects on your brain, but it hits you differently.
Now, the story that I read before about the invention of crack was that it was in the Bahamas, I believe, around the 70s. And they didn't call it crack, they called it something else. That's when they started cooking up, and then it was brought to America. Is that what you found in your research, or did you find any holes in that story?
There's some argument about which Caribbean island really gets dibs on starting. but it's for sure the Caribbean. I believe with you that the Bahamas, because it was such a huge entrepot for powder cocaine, that just trying to find a new way to market cocaine, some smart entrepreneurs started developing rock. And there were derivations in Colombia before then. It's one of these things. It's like the automobile. There's no one inventor. But yeah, the Caribbean, probably the Bahamas.
Now, the economics of crack and cocaine are a little confusing. That, like cocaine, a gram of powdered cocaine can sell in the United States, for $100 plus.
That's right.
And that price has been fairly constant since the 80s. Yeah, I mean, then it was expensive stuff. I mean, people were like $100 at 80s, or 70s prices. But anyway, people would pay this money for it. Whereas crack, and you cite there $2.50 for a crack rock. I've seen here in Mexico, people selling crack rocks, for $1 for a crack rock. How does the economics work that it could be so much cheaper when actually you use the powder and transform that into the crack? So how does it become much cheaper than the powder itself?
Yeah, so a lot of it's just clever marketing and design. So a crack rock won't get you high for very long, but all you do is, you're right. I mean, depends what country and in what place, but all you got to do is hustle up a very small amount of money, and you can get a really hard high really fast. And so a lot of people who are poor, they're never going to have $100 in their pocket, but they can hustle $3 or $5 or $2. So it's a perfect drug delivery system for folks who are poor. Also, on the other side of it, it's a perfect drug for people who want to start out as drug dealers. To be a cocaine powder drug dealer, at least back in the day, you needed probably $1,000 to get into business. Get yourself an ounce, enough to distribute grams to folks. Crack, $100. Buy a gram, divvy it up into a small amount of rocks. You could sell that in a day. Be up, double your money. By the end of a week, maybe you're making $1,000 a week. So it just was good for small-time capitalists and poor users. So again, it was just a brilliant marketing invention and a brilliant distribution system.
Now that cheapness of crack is obviously very deceptive, because although you buy, you might spend $100 buying some powder, and people who use that go out for a weekend partying, and they know I spend $100 and that's it. Whereas with the crack rock, they can spend $2.50, smoke the rock, another rock, like half an hour later, like another rock or whatever, another $2.50, and they start hustling for the money. And so it quickly becomes, they realize over a week they've spent way more than the people partying with the $100 wrap of powder.
Yeah. If you're somebody who's going to binge on either drug, you're going to spend a lot of money, or as you say, maybe the exact same amount of money. But your startup costs are different. And again, if you're poor, maybe you binge for as long as you can, and then you're out of luck for a while, and then you go steal a battery out of a car, or whatever it takes, get some copper off of a building, and you get another 5 rocks. So it just didn't take as much capital up front to get high. It wasn't good for long-term thinking. But for those who are looking for a short-term high, perfect.
Now, talk about the narrative of the book as kind of part of American history and fitting in. And, I love this quote here, where you look at the bigger picture. This is from the introduction, about this as part of the history of America. And it is part of the history of America. The history of the crack crisis is a dark tale. We prefer stories of national uplift and progress, of heroes who challenged long odds to make our country a better place. They're the great American stories. The story of crack in America offers no such uplift. It provides no such heroes, that there were men and women who struggled to bring hope and reform. The history of the crack era turns the American dream upside down. Sometimes we need to stare at the dreary reaches of our national soul to understand who we are and who we wish to be. So, it's great. Actually, I might have a slight caveat. Maybe there are some heroes in people like the original Rick Ross. There are kind of heroes in a way, anti-heroes that have come out of the kind of crack. Or, but great point there. Now, Why did it, the bigger picture here, why did America have the crack crisis? Why did this drug from the Bahamas make such a big bang in the United States?
Yeah, that's one of the things I really like to think about. Like, you write about this, we all think about this. Different times, different highs. Different drugs seem to take off at different times and places. Why does crack take off so hard in the 80s and 90s? Yeah. Why isn't it cannabis? Why isn't it heroin? Why crack? And I think it was a drug tailor-made for this time of economic disruption, of economic chaos in the United States, and a time of celebrated greed in the United States. So crack was just this drug, it hit the moment just right. And again, what's so tragic about the crack era was it was mainly used, the drug, by poor folks. It wasn't a drug that rich people used. It was just too devastating, just disrupted your life too much. So it was for poor folk. And in the 80s and 90s, while the American economy was exploding, like these were economic good times, but not for everybody. Poor people, they were locked out. So all those kind of people who didn't have a lot of schooling, but who could make a living in the 60s and 70s, those jobs kind of disappeared. Factory work, industrial work, city work was all starting to go away. So you had a kind of dispossessed class just looking for something, either looking to make some money, there's the dealers, or looking to just disappear. And those were the addicts. And I think it was just the right drug at the right time for a hard time for poor folks in the United States.
Now, you make the point that actually the majority and overall numbers of people who use crack were white.
Yeah.
Which is probably something which will surprise people. They have the image of the African American crack users. However, you say disproportionately it was affecting the African American community. Now, something I have wondered, and I don't, I'm really interested in this. I don't know if you thought about this. Is it that different communities have different tastes in drugs? I mean, like heroin, obviously, famously, heroin now, a big epidemic of heroin in poor white communities. I grew up in a city with or a town with a lot of heroin use, and knew people who overdosed of heroin as a kid. Crystal meth has its other kind of certain things. Crystal meth is massive, for example, in Asia, in the Philippines. They have huge amounts of crystal meth use, and crack disproportionately hit the poor black community. Is there any reason you think, in terms of communities, that a drug might hit one more than another, or just chance of history there?
I do think that there's culturally specific reasons for these things, and sometimes it's also where the markets are. So crack is a 24/7 kind of business. You got to sell it all the time. As we said, you only maybe are buying $5, $10, $20 at a time. So it's going to be sold in poor neighborhoods where the police are not welcome and where underground economies are common. So proximity is a piece of that story. It was easier to sell crack in poor neighborhoods. In America, those poor neighborhoods are overwhelmingly going to be people of color. So distribution networks start there and they're sold there. I also think this was a time in the 80s and 90s when the black community was bifurcated. There was a middle-class black community booming in that era. It wasn't like all black people were poor, not at all. But a lot of black people were left out. And so I think they were a perfect market for a drug of oblivion. There's different drugs of oblivion at different times. Heroin is a classic drug of oblivion. Amphetamines are a different kind of drug. They supply a different kind of high and a different need. And I think people look for different highs for different purposes. This one fit the need of that poor community at that time.
So it was like people taking a lot of crack just to deal with the hardships they're going through at that time, just taking crack just to forget about stuff for a short time.
Yeah, think of gin in England in the 17th, 18th century. Poor folks just wasted gin.
Yeah.
Poor folk tend to need something that just removes them from the misery of the everyday.
Depression. Now obviously, as you document, this, you have this terrible feedback loop where people were suffering, and then there's a big input of drugs, and then the suffering gets worse. It makes the situation worse. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of things happening at this time in the 80s. One figure you cite, which is pretty crazy. The homicide rate for is it African American teenagers? I think is it in the era, or poor? I'm not sure exactly the metrics there. Doubled during this era. I mean, that's an incredible thing there. The number of kids from poor African American communities in foster homes like doubled in this era. Yeah. So like some real, I mean, this is real social upheaval in some of these communities. What were the mechanics of that? Why did how did from taking a rock, cocaine, people selling on the street lead to this level of violence, this level of kids who were basically orphaned without parents in this era?
Yeah, so it's both sides of the equation, both the sellers and the users. So this was a very lucrative market. You could make millions of dollars if you controlled a lot of territory and sold a lot of crack. It's an illegal drug, so the only way to enforce territorial disputes is violence. And because the entry point was so cheap, in other words, it didn't take a lot of capital to get into the game, there were constant new players trying to seize territory. And because they couldn't use lawyers, they couldn't use contracts, they couldn't use patents, they used guns. And they were killing each other over territory. That's who's killing each other. It's mainly gangsters killing gangsters. So you make an illegal drug really lucrative, bad things are going to happen. The other side of that is, again, crack was a hard drug. It could put you into a place where all you cared about was getting high. That doesn't mix very well with parenting. And so people who fell prey to the pipe, they became pretty bad parents. And in a community where people were already poor and there often was only one parent looking after a kid, when that parent fell prey to crack, where's that kid going to go? Hopefully grandma, hopefully auntie, maybe foster care. So yeah, hugely disruptive to family life in the 80s and 90s.
Now, this was also a big media story at the time, a big news story. And there was what was it called, 48 Hours on Crack Street, or those big things, and and then there was the story. I'll say the story because there's a lot of myths, and the question is going to be about the bad reporting here. The story of crack babies, which now another book I read there about this talks about the myth, a lot of this stuff, the bad reporting, a lot of this stuff. They kind of immediately go to hospital looking for a crack baby, and then find something. They wouldn't find it. It wasn't that simple. Or create these kind of myths about crack babies, these kind of crazy mutants, crack babies. It's kind of how much do you see that as part of this story? Now we're looking at it from a historical perspective in 2019, looking back at this 30 years later. How much do you see that reporting was bad or even harmful? How the media covered the crack epidemic in that time?
Well, got to say the first thing first. You just said violence went up, foster care children went up. There were some really bad outcomes from people who fell prey to crack. But some of the stuff was just made up and hysterical. So I think there was a fear that somehow people would take crack and their babies would be doomed and they would have neurological damage, and that was that. Okay, turns out, no, that wasn't the case. I think part of it was, again, if you were pregnant and you smoked a lot of crack, you were not going to have good maternal care. You were probably going to have a baby that was underweight, a baby that could have been damaged through violence. So there were bad outcomes, but they weren't the outcomes that the media tended to focus on. There was no such thing as a crack baby who was doomed. But these were not pregnancies that had good outcomes either. You take a grain of truth and then you don't have good public health information and you run amok with it. And I think that hysteria played to the need then to punish people so hard who fell prey to crack or were petty dealers of crack. So the mass media's role was useful in spreading the dangers of crack. There were real dangers, but it was kind of social panic, a kind of hysteria. And that just made the punishment regime brutal.
So then this all fitted in to how there was big response to this with the justice system, and particularly when later under Clinton, and now Joe Biden is come back to ask answer questions about this. So obviously this is very, very connected. How the government responded, and then there was this whole issue as well of people selling crack, doing long prison sentences, and there sometimes being a mismatch between crack being associated with African Americans and those punishments as opposed to LSD and what that was. Although there's stories about that, interesting stories about that as well. So how should we do you look now as a historian at that response from the criminal justice system and that mass incarceration? This is a time when the prison system really went up to reach the more than 2 million people in the US prison system now, more than anywhere else in the world. How do you look at that whole process, and perhaps how do you judge that historically now, and in a time where now from Donald Trump and to the Democrats, people are saying this is not the right way to go anymore to incarcerate such high numbers of people?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where historical perspective is just, I don't know, kind of mind-numbing or mind-blowing. I'm not sure which one. You think back to the 1970s, and the United States at least came really close to decriminalizing marijuana and cocaine. It almost happened in the 1970s. And then there was a kind of, again, panic. And the panic was based on some real stuff. Teenage use of marijuana had skyrocketed in the 1970s. It's not the 1960s, it's the 70s. I think a lot of parents freaked out, and they were just terrified of drugs, irrationally usually. I mean, their kids were getting drunk. What was the difference between getting high on marijuana or getting drunk? I mean, but there was a panic, and the Reagan administration really picked up on that panic. And I think it was white parents were terrified that their marijuana smoking suburban kids would fall prey to crack cocaine, that it was a slippery slope, a gateway drug, and that suddenly they'd be crack addicts selling their bodies on Fifth Avenue or something. And it was that white fear that really just upped the ante and made a merciless regime. And it turned out in this case that the people selling the drug were disproportionately, overwhelmingly African American. And that again goes to that 24/7 drug market thing, and where you could sell drugs. You couldn't do that in nice suburban communities. And so then it gets racialized. It's black people perhaps stringing out white kids. And then you get racial panic. And the result was these 5-year prison sentences for having like a paper clip's worth of crack cocaine. 10 years for having like, a handful of crack cocaine. That was worse than if you raped somebody. So we just created this incarceration machine. And it was a machine aimed at black people. Poor, young black people.
Yeah, I mean, another figure that blew me away that you had was the official rate of unemployment for young African Americans. I think it was 40%.
Yeah.
In this time of boom. I mean, that was just incredible. I had no idea it was anything like that high. So you have this incarceration machine, and the crack era is an era we're looking at historically. It's not now, it's a different ballgame. This thing does happen and go down. So why does it go down? Why does, and I guess this ties into the murder rate in New York going down drastically, the murder rate in Los Angeles going down drastically. But so what happens there? Why does this kind of crack era come to an end, or go to a different phase in America?
This is what we were talking about before, and it's again one of these wild kind of stories, like why is a drug popular, and then why does it lose popularity? With crack, I don't think it's a big surprise. I mean, just imagine being 14 years old, living in a poor black community, and you look around at your older brother or your uncle or somebody, and they're like a crackhead, and they're like smoking the pipe. They weigh 120 pounds. All they do is hustle. They rob your mother of her purse. You're like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a crackhead. It wasn't fear of going to jail. I don't think it was fear of I'll become neurologically damaged. It was like, who wants to get high like that? I'd rather smoke some cannabis.
Yeah.
I'd rather try some PCP. I mean, I'll try a different drug. I still want to get high. I just want to get high like that. And so I think crack was just so devastating to too many people that it lost its popularity. And there's still people who smoke crack now. I lived in Philadelphia not that long ago. I could watch people smoke crack 20 feet from me in the alley. But it was really kind of down and out types who seemed to still think crack was the way to go. It just was too devastating a high. The high wasn't worth it. And I think that's why it lost its popularity.
That's fascinating. Was there more hope among the generation who kind of grew up in the 1990s or 2000s than the generation who grew up in the 70s and 80s who really got into crack? Was there other factors that were making people more positive to go down the road, you think, or just simply they saw the crack was a bad thing, it became less, cool to do crack, or less, not cool, that's maybe a bad word, less appealing to do crack for the people who saw the...
I think there's a public health piece to it too. So I think there really was some actually good, useful education on the downside of certain kinds of drugs. Heroin's really bad for you. Crystal meth is not a long-term solution. And I think people got educated to some of that and they turned away from it. I think people are still getting intoxicated. People are still getting high. Different drugs, different times. Legal cannabis seems to be doing quite well in the United States. So it isn't like people turned away from drugs. They just turned away from certain kinds of drugs. I don't think we're ever going to have a drug-free society, whatever the heck that would mean.
Yeah.
We're just going to have to figure out how to make sense of what kind of intoxications are acceptable to us or fun. And that's the world we live in.
Now, you mentioned before, and you talk about this being a story as part of American capitalism. And there were some people who are quite open about the fact they were involved in selling crack and then put that money into businesses. Mm-hmm. One of them is people from Rockefeller Records. I believe Jay-Z's group. Yeah, I mean, they said that they say it's on documentaries. They were selling crack and they have money and they put that money and they use the same techniques they'd learned hustling and building a business selling crack into like building a business selling hip hop. So how much do you see that? It's kind of the dark side of capitalism. How does this connect to the kind of the legal side of capitalism from the black market? How much can you see that movement between them, or do most of these black market hustlers simply end up dead or in jail?
Well, a lot of the guys who are really good in the underground economy had a hard time transitioning to the above ground economy. It's not the exact same skill set. Learn how to punch somebody in the face or shoot them in the knee, doesn't translate into running a record label perfectly. But there were plenty of people who just saw this as a way to raise capital. And it's harder to tell those stories. Again, journalists and historians share the same thing. It's easy to find the people who get caught. Yeah. It's easy to read the trial transcripts, interview somebody who's in jail. But the person who quietly amassed $500,000 and then used it to start up 3 nail salons, that's a harder story to find. That's where I started this book, actually. I was really interested in that, the relationship between the underground economy and black capital. Because I knew from my own family experience, I'm Jewish, there were a lot of Jewish gangsters back in the 1910s and 20s when they were locked out of a lot of the economy. Jews ran a lot of rackets. And that money eventually made its way into above ground economies. I know this personally.
So your family, you have a story there. You have some of your family were Jewish gangsters back in the day.
I'll just keep it on the down low. But my grandpa grew up on the west side of Chicago. They were poor folks, gangsters, non-gangsters. They were all mixing together, just like the hip hop community. They all knew each other. And my grandpa put on jazz concerts. Where did he get the money to start the jazz concerts? He didn't rob anybody, but his friends had the money to give him to set up the business. Gray economy. And right. I think in the black community, in the poor parts of some cities, that's how you raise capital. And it's an interesting story. Those who made it, Jay-Z, is above board about it. Neighborhood I lived in, Philadelphia, sure had a lot of small boutiques where nobody was going in and out the door, as far as I could tell. They were laundering money. That's just part of the world.
Now talking about black market economics, and there's something I'm very interested in and struggle to understand. I think there's not a lot of good academic research on this. About this. There was a book written by a colleague, Narconomics, which kind of looked at the drug trafficking industry on a bigger scale, trying to apply some economic ideas. And I've been trying to look at this with a new book I've just finished a draft of about gun trafficking and the kind of economics of gun trafficking, the economics of the firearms black market. Now, do you think that the black market economy, the illegal economy, could you figure out any rules, any clear rules to the illegal economy? I mean, does it basically follow the same laws of the free market, or how does it differ, do you think, between the illegal economy of selling crack and the legal economy of selling tobacco or selling alcohol in the same period?
Well, the same laws of economics apply, but the constricting factors are so different. And that's what I found so fascinating, watching guys who tried to create stable illegal businesses. So not the guys who were just on the corner and got in and out of it quickly. Like, how do you create a stable business? And so there's some of the same rules apply. I was really impressed with the Gangster Disciples, one of the biggest distributors in Chicago. They had a firm hierarchy, an organizational chart. They had rules and regulations. They had disciplinary measures. And I don't just mean violence, but they had ways to kind of incentivize people to sell. So they sort of looked like General Motors in a funhouse mirror. But on the other hand, if you broke one of their rules, you'd get beat up. If you stole, you got killed. And then they were constantly opportunistic. So if somebody looked weak, a rival looked weak, again, they take them. They either beat them or kill them. So I don't know, they didn't beat them like Donald Trump says, I'm a killer. I use lawyers to get what I want. No, these guys killed people.
Yeah.
So in these businesses, you bleed.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you have, many years ago, I worked for a sales company, just selling stuff, and to motivate people, you'd have to really push hard on hitting certain numbers. And if you hit higher, you'd be like praised and get bonuses. And one time it was if you hit lower, like really low, you'd have to eat chili peppers. And it's actually happened. We were selling like golf tickets for golf courses. And it was me. I had the lowest numbers, and I brought the whole team down. So they all ate chili peppers with I quit the next day. It was humiliation. But so you have those kind of things in some areas of the kind of league. Okay. People do boiler room type stuff. But yeah, they kind of exaggerated in the illegal economy where you can push these things further. And then obviously the issue of violence for control of terrain. And in some ways the illegal economy is what extreme libertarians kind of like the idea of. The idea of because they're breaking the rules and doing whatever they like. I'm sure some libertarians will be mad about that and hit me back on that point. But you see what I'm saying? That there's I agree. Yeah, just people do whatever you like. There's no restrictions of law.
Yeah, I think it's a grim reminder that predatory capitalism is pretty scary. I think of it as buccaneer capitalism too. These guys were like pirates. They were operating in this realm, right, where there's no real rules, and the only rule comes either from internal discipline or when the state comes crashing down. And it's really interesting how rare the crashing down from the state was. It's mainly internal discipline. So yeah, it's capitalism at its most raw. It's a continuum from every other kind of business.
Now, obviously these bad things bring out some, there's cultural expressions. Very, very obvious one in this case of a certain part of hip hop. And hip hop was both, hip hop came before the crack era really kicked in. It began in the 70s, and but obviously it was around, and there was a certain part of hip hop reflecting this very heavily, a certain part of hip hop critiquing this. Are you a fan of hip hop yourself, or
Sure.
You're a big fan of these, and how do you think the crack era was reflected in hip hop, and was this a really great, you cite these songs, NWA Dope Man, are these great songs of, great American songs, or how do you look at this cultural expression coming from that?
Yeah, I always think of the hip hop guys as sort of like the organic intellectuals of this world. And so they're the guys who are sometimes really part of it, sometimes just a side to it. And they're trying to figure it out. Like, what is this about that some guy on the block can make $1 million? That's amazing, right? I mean, here's these poor folks who can make $1 million. Stack up cash, as they say. Yeah. So there was a kind of social banditry piece of this, a Robin Hood piece of this story. Again, poor folks who just wanted a main chance like anybody else. And the hip hop artists, they celebrate some of this. It's one 20-year-old looking at another 20-year-old and saying, we're both coming up hard and we both found a way out. And, you can understand why people celebrated it. There is within hip hop too a critique of this. How much damage you're doing to your sisters and brothers, how much damage you're doing to your family. So, it's not one dimensional. But it was a cultural realm, and they both came up in the same realm, in the same neighborhoods, the same communities. And as you said earlier, sometimes the record labels are intertwined with drug money. And so it's a great story, tragic story, but also an incredible story.
Just to round off, then this talk about this, a last question about this, and if I've missed out anything, please feel free to add here. But one of the we talk about we should study history to not repeat history, although that's often falls on deaf ears. Or we study what lessons now we're in 2019. A lot of the lessons are important for today's narrative. I mean, this book is very important today. I think it's going to have a big impact on thinking today, because a lot of these issues of race are now very strong, and the incarceration, but also of drugs and drug addiction. El Chapo, went to sentence recently. They used some of the crack epidemic as part of the argument against him, and in the court they traced back the cocaine, back to the 80s. But also the now the heroin epidemic now. I know, a very, very different drug epidemic, or maybe isn't that different, but a different drug epidemic now today. What lessons can we learn from this, and how should we look at this in terms of how we're dealing with these problems today?
Yeah, all sorts of different things come out of this. The easiest comparison is, you're right, how we treat the opioid epidemic and the crack epidemic. Suddenly, opioid epidemic is a public health crisis. The other one was a carceral problem. We've got to lock everybody up. I think race has a lot to do with that. I think class has a lot to do with that. Are you going to put a pharmaceutical executive in jail for 25 years? Maybe you take something out of his pocket, but you won't put him in jail for 25 years. It's a good thing. We're understanding there's a public health problem. That's a good news story. The harder story, I think, is trying to figure out, what do you do with the fact that you had a bunch of teenagers and people in their 20s who actually had a lot of talent, who had the discipline to start businesses, who had the smarts to create a good organization that could distribute a product effectively and efficiently. And it's kind of a reminder again, like, there's talent all over the place. And it's our fault if we can't figure out how to harness that talent and give people opportunities. And to me, that was like the funniest lesson. Was like, I talked to some of these guys. It's like, this guy's really smart. This guy's really clever. What a shame he had to go 15 years into the penitentiary. And somehow we can break those cycles if we figure out everybody's got talent, if we can just find ways to organize it. Yeah, some people are always going to go to the dark side and make money the easiest way possible. But that to me was the other side. Capitalism brings out the worst in us, and it can bring out the best in us if we can harness the talent. So crack cocaine, no simple answers, but a lot of lessons.
I mean that's great, and it made me think a bit of I watched the Dave Chappelle special on Netflix. He made a joke about the heroin epidemic and the crack epidemic, and he said him watching the heroin epidemic, he now knows what white people feel watching the crack epidemic. He doesn't care. So he kind of he made a joke about that thing. It was harder for me to say that than how Dave Chappelle said it. But that's great. Really, really fascinating stuff. Great to talk to you, and thanks to everyone following this. We've got loads of great interviews in this series. Crime War coming up. I've got an interview with one of the founders of the MS-13 gang. I've got interviews with somebody who did do 21 years in prison for LSD during this time as a kickback, and an interview with the Mexican president Felipe Calderon. So a lot of good stuff on these to get deeper into this issue and try and find some solutions to this problem, which is really, the problem of drug trafficking really hitting down here in Mexico and Latin America, but affecting many countries.